Now it is on to the fifth and final attempt in the Theaetetus to explain what are these things that we call false judgments. We make them all the time. We all make them. No specialized group in any way makes them. What are these things? Well, it's easy to point out a false judgment, but how exactly do we make false judgments? So far, that's eluded our host, Socrates. Theaetetus is thoroughly confused. We've seen a variety of ways of doing this, but most with this notion of exchange or interchange. And then we saw this lovely little example of the mind as a block of wax. Now we're looking at another one, and maybe even a more poetic notion of the mind. That is that the soul is like an aviary. It's full of birds. And not literally, but we're going to start thinking of birds or pieces of knowledge kind of floating around. And what's different is in the wax model, it was entrenched. Everything was stable. But here we've got this notion that you have pieces of knowledge kind of floating around. So how does that change our story? All right, well, there's a bit of a shift of gears here. And Socrates does admit, well, you know, Theaetetus, we have been cheating a little bit, so to speak. Maybe cheating is too harsh of a word. But there's been a little sleight of hand going on. Think of it. We don't know what knowledge is, right? That's the goal, right? Episteme, don't lose sight. That's the whole goal here, is to figure out what knowledge is. But yet we've been saying things about knowledge. We've been talking as if in a way that we were pretty comfortable to say, well, that's not knowledge, or maybe that is, or maybe that. How do we justify that kind of talk when we're claiming we don't know what knowledge is? Well, we seem to have some understanding of some kind or some notion. Well, let's dig a little bit back into this. Socrates says something along these lines. We're going to shift gears here. We're going to go from one notion of knowing to a different notion, but related. Not too far away, but we're going to open this up a little bit. We're going to loosen this notion of knowing in a way. How is that? Well, he says it's popular to say that knowing is having knowledge. Well, seems pretty straightforward. That knowing is having knowledge. Let's loosen it a little bit and say, well, knowing is possessing knowledge. Okay, now why the shift? Now, having and possessing, aren't they the same thing? Well, we often use, having and possessing, but we also, in the same way, interchangeably, that's fine. But Socrates wants to drive a little bit of a wedge in between the two. Think of it this way. The possessing is more of shall we say, a passive, and having is a little bit more active. They're related, but think of it this way. You can possess X, whatever X happens to be, without using it. For example, right now I possess a coat, but I'm not wearing it, right? So you have lots of things are included amongst your possessions, but you don't have them right now. Right? And we do this all the time. Yeah, do you possess something, or do you have it, but I don't have it with me right now. So if we wanted to be a little bit clearer, you'd say, yeah, I own something. I own it, but I don't have it with me right now. It's at home. But I still own it. So if someone goes and takes it, it's still taking my stuff. So you can possess a coat, but not currently using it. So that idea of possession being a more passive, and the actually having it being connected with more of a use. So that's the distinction that Socrates wants to open up a little bit between having, which is kind of an active, and possessing, which is a little bit more, shall we say, passive. All right, on to the metaphor. The aviary, right? The aviary is like a big container, like, with wire and all that. And I've drawn sort of this big cube where this is sort of like the wires. And inside are a bunch of birds flying around. So this is the model now of the mind. It's a very dynamic one. So you can think, oh, yeah, well, this has some maybe more possibilities for explanation, because on the wax one, model, everything is stationary. But now you know what it's like when you're trying to remember something. It's on the tip of my tongue, and maybe other things are getting in the way. Like if I want to make it difficult for you to remember something, I may introduce something that's sort of relevant and but not quite the same thing, and then you'll struggle to recall something. So your memory can, it's a bit, shall we say, it's a bit fluid. It can things can move around, and you almost feel sometimes when you're trying to remember something, it's not just a search for something that's there. It almost feels like, oh, this memory keeps moving around. So this idea of the mind being like an aviary is not terribly fanciful. It actually seems to correspond a bit to our ordinary experience. Okay, so learning and all these kinds of things, you're on the hunt for knowledge, right? And that's to have a more active of what you possess. Like, oh, where's my coat? You're looking around for your coat. I know that I possess it. Where is it? Or sometimes you're trying to recall a memory. Yeah, I'm a little bit rusty, and so these things seem to come in a bit handy. Or sorry, the aviary example seems to come in a bit handy. So, and how is error produced now? Because remember, don't lose sight of it. It's not just to handle, ordinary everyday things. Great if it does, but the intended domain that the model is supposed to explain is the domain of ordinary error, right? Not fanciful stuff where you would introduce that someone's ill or whatever. No. Just ordinary, rationally grounded error. How do you handle that? Well, it could be when you're on the hunt for the knowledge that you want to turn it from a possessing of it to a having. So you're and the Greeks loved metaphors of hunting. They were always talking like that. Remember, the beginning of our dialogue has a hunting metaphor from Socrates. So on the hunt for knowledge, right? So that's how lovely little things that Plato does to pull the dialogue together through various allusions and images. It's to have active what you possess. So to keep in line with the imagery here, you could grasp where you're on the hunt for a dove in here, and you grasp a hawk, right? Which could be, quite disastrous if you were preparing for a dove and all of a sudden you find in your hands you have a hawk. Well, in a little bit more abstract notion of how it relates maybe to error amongst thoughts and things like that, is you wanted the number 12, but you grasped the number 11. So in that sense, it could be just mistaken. Things are moving around and you grab one, you're intending to grab one thing, and you end up grabbing another. So in that sense, that's what's going on in the mind. It's a little bit more of a shall we say, a little bit more of a confused atmosphere. Things are not stable. They're moving around. This clearly this model here of the aviary is, again, picked up in the history of Western philosophy. You can find a kind of aviary model, although the word aviary is not used. But this notion of ideas and memories and things, float like a dust storm of these things in the mind. You can find that in Hume. You can find it a little bit, we'll see, in Locke, but it's certainly in many ways there in Hume. So we'll see some of these images and metaphors come back in philosophy. Okay, so basically we've got this going for one thing, grasped and got something else. So I intended to get one thing, and I was surprised. There you go. There's your notion of error. So how's this going to stand up? Well, Socrates says it's going to be not a bad thing, but he says, wait a second. Now we're talking about pieces of knowledge flying around. Maybe that's okay. But now we're going to be talking again about getting pieces of knowledge accidentally exchanged with each other. And we've talked a lot about that already. Isn't this just the same thing coming back with a nice little metaphor, but it's the same problem? Can you really confuse 11 and 12? Can you really confuse hawks and doves when you, even if it's only the possessing, but wouldn't you say, I can't really make those kinds of confusions like we saw in the earlier cases, like 1 and 2 and 3, in parts 1 and 2 and 3 in this discussion of false judgment. So that seems to be problematic, grabbing the wrong piece of knowledge. And it seems also that error is somehow in virtue of possessing knowledge in the first place, that error is somehow grounded on the possession of knowledge. That seems counterintuitive as well. So it seems that you would have to possess knowledge in order to be in error of what you grasp. This seems, Socrates makes a little bit of fun of this, and he says if somehow having or possessing knowledge can make us ignorant, right? If this possession of knowledge can make you ignorant, well then perhaps blindness could make us see things. So Socrates doesn't really take this, he makes a few jokes about it. But he says it's just going to be problematic that the soul knows, and then the second more trenchant position is that the soul kind of knows things, and again, it can mistake things both two things that it knows. And this just leads us back to the problems of our earlier discussions. So again, the model seems to work. It provides a nice image, but upon reflection, we see the same problems start cropping up again. And Socrates says, well, looks like this isn't going to work either. So not only the wax model, but the Avery model is not going to work. Now, what I've given you is a fairly simple, orthodox, more or less interpretation of what's going on. Like the wax model, like any of these discussions that we've seen regarding the possibility of explaining false judgments, much ink has been spilled on them. So no different here. But this gives you at least shall we say, it's a bit of a gateway discussion if you wish to go much deeper into the various arguments and the various different kinds, shall we say, the various interpretations of what's going on and how people spin it slightly differently, or they read it slightly differently. But this is sort of an overall, and I think reasonably accurate presentation. So that's it. That's 5 attempts to figure out what false judgment, and they are, as I've said, these are the 5 false judgments and the 5 failed attempts to explain false judgment. Didn't work in any of the 5, so Socrates says, well, this isn't going to work. That's too bad, but I guess it's probably, maybe it was futile in the first place to try and explain. Maybe did we put a cart ahead of a horse or something? Socrates says maybe it was the big problem. The big problem was thinking that we could explain a false judgment when we still really didn't know what knowledge is. We've got some kind of rough idea around the edges of what knowledge is. So, but not a precise enough notion to really dig in and come up with a good explanation of how we get things wrong. So Socrates says, what are we going to do? We're not going to give up our big quest of what is episteme, what is knowledge. We've ruled out a number of things. We've made some progress by figuring out what things aren't and how things may not work, but we still don't know how things exactly do work with false judgments, but we do make them. So Socrates says, well, my dear Theaetetus, it is time to put this discussion to bed, and we will return back to our main focus, namely, what is episteme? Stay tuned.